Hello everyone. Today we are going to cover lecture 17. Basically in our last lecture we started chapter 9 and we're going to finish chapter 9 in today's lecture. Basically lecture 17 is the latter part of chapter 9. So in the last lecture we learned a great deal of information about fiscal policy, how it works, what its objectives are, what are the assumptions, and when it is implemented, and how it brings an economy out of recession. Today we are going to look into some other macroeconomic factors such as public debt, which is very important, especially in today's time when the government is spending so much money to revive the economy, how it will reflect in terms of public debt. Then we will also talk about supply side economics and finish this chapter. So moving on to the first to slide 2 of this lecture, if you see, public debt basically refers to an accounting or the summation of all the past deficit and surpluses of a country from previous years. So it's basically a past tense. So you might confuse it with a budget deficit, but basically they're different. Budget deficit is for a current year. What is the negative balance that the government has in the current year, whereas public debt is a summation of all the past deficits and surpluses for the country. So just to be clear, let me show you this. Let's say we take 4 years, for example. Let's say we take 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. Okay, so let's say we have 4 years, and then in 2017, let's say we have a budget deficit of 20 million. Okay, let's say in 2018 we have a budget deficit of 25 million. In 2019, let's say we have a surplus of, let's say, $1 million. Okay, and in 2020, let's say because of coronavirus, the government has to spend a lot of money again, so they get into a deficit, and let's say the deficit is now 10 million negative. So again, these numbers are something I just gave you. It's not like you have to calculate, but basically what I'm trying to say is, whenever the budget of the government is a negative number, then it is a budget deficit. So this is budget deficit. This is a budget deficit, right? Because the budget has balanced to a negative number for the government. So government have spent more than the tax revenues they have received. In this year 2020, the minus 10 million is also a budget deficit. But for 2019, we have a positive number, so that is budget surplus, right? Well, because the balance is positive, so the government has extra money of $1 million, and that is budget surplus. Okay, so they spent less than the tax revenues they have received, and the balance that is left over is a $1 million, so that's budget surplus. So for each year, we will have budget deficit or budget surplus. So any one year, any particular year, we will have either budget deficit or budget surplus. But when we are talking about public debt, so if we are talking about public debt, what it means is it's a past tense, and it is a summation of all these numbers. Okay, so we sum the budget deficits and budget surpluses in the previous years to get a final number. That is public debt. So if we look at it in this case, the public debt would be 20 million minus 20 million minus 25 million plus 1 million minus 10 million, right? So if we add these up, it adds up to, so 20 plus 25 is 45, 45 plus 10 is 55. So minus 55 plus 1 is basically minus 54 million. So that is public debt. So hopefully this explains or tells you what is the difference between a budget deficit or and public debt. Basically, budget deficit is the negative balance that a government can have on a particular year, but public debt is basically when we are adding the budget deficit and budget surplus of all the previous years to get a final number. So that's what public debt is. It is the past tense, and it is the sum of all the previous years budget deficits and surpluses. Uh, Moving on, so basically this public debt amount, let's say we got minus 54 million, here we got minus 54 million. This is just a number. So basically public debt is a positive economics because it's just a statement of facts. However, we have to associate normative economics with it. If you remember, normative economics is basically you are providing subjective opinions based on the facts. So basically this number does not mean anything unless we provide some opinions, like, why did this number go up over the years, or why did this number go down over the years. We need to analyze as voters, as students, we need to know, and we have to ask these questions and know why the public debt has gone up or gone down over the years. Like in the US, the public debt has gone up significantly over the years. And as economists and as students of the economics class, we have to ask, why did this go up, and what does it mean? What does it mean for us, or what significance does this increase in public debt have to us as citizens of the country? So just to give you a brief overview about the deficits, budget deficits and budget surpluses in the US history, like, before the World War II, US usually had little budget deficit or little or some budget surplus, but during World War II, that's when the budget deficits increased significantly for the country, or for the US. And now again, think about it. During the World War II, the government was spending heavily on military and defense, right? Because they wanted to win the war. They were providing more money into the military industry to build more tanks, ships, missiles, guns. So there was a lot of spending in that area. So government was spending, and as a result, they were spending more than the tax revenue they were receiving. So there was a lot of budget deficit. And also, if you remember from our previous lectures, that the Great Depression was basically revived once the government was spending during World War II on the military industry. So during World War II, the government was spending a lot of money compared to what tax revenues they were spending. As a result, the balance of the budget had a deficit, and it was pretty big compared to the previous years. Okay. But in the 1980s, if you look at the deficit of if you look at the deficits and surpluses, and if you look at the public debt of the government, it was starting from the 1980s that the government's deficit has gone up significantly, or the government's public debt also went up significantly. So we can deduce from here that since 1980s, government is probably more hands-on into the economy. Government is probably providing more services to the people of the US, or government is probably more involved in the economy, and they're spending on a different types of industry, maybe military, maybe healthcare, maybe educational sector. So all these are causing more deficits in the society. For a short period of time between 1998 to 2001, the government had a surplus. So basically government was spending less during that period. But again, if we go back to 2008 and 2009, when the recession hit, the housing market collapsed, that's when the government had to come in and again enacted the fiscal policy to take the economy out of the recession. The deficit has gone up significantly again. And if we look at it in today's circumstance, during this coronavirus pandemic, government has again increased its spending in the economy. So when we will, after a couple of years, when we will look back to 2020, we will see public debt and budget deficits had gone up significantly in the year 2020, because the government spending also went up more than the tax revenues they received in order to revive the economy or to support the economy. So right now, before this coronavirus, the US had a total public debt of approximately $11 trillion. That's basically the summation of all the deficits and surpluses of the previous years. And this public debt can be expressed as a per capita basis, or basically a per person basis. So if we are saying that in the US the public debt is $11 trillion, so how much does each individual in the US own that debt? Like how much each of us as citizens of the US own that debt? Okay, so basically public debt per capita, or per capita public debt, is the debt that every man, woman and child in the US owes, and measures their individual portion of the debt, or basically every child, man, woman and child, what is their portion of the debt in the total public debt of the country. And it is given by the formula. Let me do it here. It has a formula, and this formula is important because there will be a problem like this in your next homework, as well as there will be a question on this in your exam. So make sure you understand this example. So public debt per capita is given by the formula public debt per capita is given by total deaths divided by total population. That is the formula for per capita public debt. Now this total debt, this is inflation adjusted, so we have to adjust this number for inflation and then calculate the per capita public debt or per person public debt. So take note of this formula. Public debt per capita is equals to total debt divided by total population, and that total debt is adjusted for inflation. Now this can be for a country, it can be for a city, it can be for a state or a county. Okay, so moving on, we will do an example of this so that it's completely clear to you guys. So let's assume in Texas, let's say in 2018, the total public debt in Texas in 2018 was 5.1 or $51 billion. Okay, let's say that was the total public debt in Texas in 2018. Now in 2018 the inflation was 2.5%. Okay, so we are given with this, and then we also know that the total population of Texas in 2018 was 28.7 million. So we are given with this information. Now I ask you to calculate the per capita public debt, because we live in Texas, right? So we want to know what is the per capita public debt, or how much of this 51 billion, how much each of us as Texas residents owe, right? Like, or what is our portion of the debt out of this 51 billion. That's what we are trying to calculate. Okay, so there's two steps involved for this. Step one, again, remember, we have to adjust the public debt for inflation, and that is the main reason I gave you the inflation rate. So what we have to do is inflation adjusted debt. We have to calculate that, and it's using the formula we learned before. Same way we adjusted to GDP or income in our previous classes. Like in chapter 5 and 6, we learned how to adjust inflation, how to adjust GDP, like from nominal GDP to real GDP, or how we converted nominal income to real income. Same way here, we convert the nominal public debt to real public debt. So we know it's 51 billion divided by your price index. Now price index, if you remember, price index is equals to 100 plus your inflation rate. So that is 102.5, right? So we divide the nominal public debt by the price index times 100, and we end up with, we end up with an answer of, now we kept the billion at it as it is, so basically what I did was just 51 divided by 102.5 times 100, that ends up with 49.76 billion. This is real number or real deaths, which means this has been adjusted for inflation. So when we are given with this type of information, the first step is to calculate the real debt, and now we move on to calculate the per capita public debt. So per capita public debt, which we will calculate as real total debt divided by your population. Okay, now we have to convert this. Okay, so we know the real total debt is 49, okay, 760, because it's billion, so we convert them into zeros, comma 000, divided by the total population, which if you go up is given by as 28.7 million. So let's again convert these into zeros. So we will have 28,700,000. Okay, and if you put it in a calculator, you will see you will get an answer of 1734 per person. Okay, so what does this number means? What does this 1734 per person number means? What it means is, out of this 51 billion public debt in Texas, each of us in Texas, our portion of the debt is 1734 in that particular year, in 2018. So basically our portion of the debt, or what we owe, is 1734 out of the 51 billion total public debt that Texas has. So hopefully this clarifies you. Again, if we give you this information, the first step is this 51 billion is a nominal number. So basically we have to convert it to a real debt, or in order to adjust it for inflation, and we calculate the price index. Then we divide the nominal debt by the price index times 100, we get the real debt, and then we calculate in the second step the per capita public debt, which is our real debt divided by population, and we end up with this result. So hope this example is clear to guys, and we will have a very similar example or very similar type of problem in your homework and your exam. All right, so let's go back to the slide. So we already did an example, and also another thing is, in the 1980s, the per person in US, the per person public debt or per capita public debt was only 3,900. But if we look at today's, or in 2014, the per capita public debt is 55,000. So it has gone up dramatically, and we can tell from 1980 to 2014, government is probably more involved with the economy. Government is probably spending a lot more than the tax revenues they are receiving. So our public debt is also going up. Per person's public debt has also gone up. Again, as voters and students, you must consider why the public debt has gone over. Mostly the reason is engagement in various types of global conflicts, as well as participating in various types of wars, such as the Kuwait wars, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, then the war in Afghanistan. And then we also had recessions in the meantime, like in 2008 and 9, we had the housing market collapse when the economy collapsed. Basically, that's when the government had to come into the scene, inject money into different types of industries to revive the economy. So that, again, all these factors cause deficits, and as a result, the public debt per capita has gone up over the years. Now, I want to shift a little bit, focus on supply side economics. Basically, this is supply side economics is a branch of classical economics and new classical economics. Again, if you remember from the previous lectures, we have three different types of models: classical, Keynesians, and new classical. But the supply side economics is more a combination of the new classical economics, but the basis is classical, but then it would be branched under new classical economics, and it focuses on supply forces in order to achieve growth, employment, and output. And according to this theory, if there is an increase in your aggregate supply, there will be an increase in output, reduction in prices, increase in income, and increase in employment. Okay, so what this supply side economist people are saying, which is a group of new classical people, they are saying is, if we focus on the aggregate supply, and if we increase the aggregate supply, causing the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right, the output will go up, prices will go down, more employment will be created, and income will go up. So it's a good thing overall. Now, this group of people also came up with a curve called the Laffer curve. So if you look at slide 9, it talks about Laffer curve. Laffer curve is basically a graphical representation where it gives us a relationship between the marginal tax rate and the tax revenues collected by the government. Okay, and it is something that the supply side economists came up with, and I want to show you how it looks like. So the Laffer curve, if I ask you to draw a Laffer curve, make sure you draw this curve. It looks like an inverted U or an inverted cup, and then on the x-axis we have tax rate, so make sure you label your axis, otherwise it makes no sense. And then on the y-axis we have tax revenue. Okay, and this is known as Laffer curve. Okay, this is a point B, and this is known as Laffer. So the supply side economist, through this Laffer curve, is trying to give us a relationship between tax rate and the tax revenues that the government collects. Okay, now in general, what do we know? If the tax rates go up, the tax revenue will go up. If the tax rates go down, the tax revenue will also go down that the government is collecting. However, the supply side economists are using the Laffer curve give us a different explanation. And here you will see that what they are saying. So let's assume we have a point here, point A. Okay, so what they are saying, if we are moving from point A to point B, so if we are moving from point to B to point B, let's say this was 10% tax rate, now this is, let's say, 6% tax rate. If we are decreasing tax rate up to a certain point, then tax revenues is actually going up, right? Because your tax revenue is more now. But up to a certain point. Now, if we go to 4%, that's when your tax revenue is going down. So these supply side economists are saying, if we are reducing the tax rate, or if the government is reducing the tax rate, then tax revenue will go up, but up to a certain point. So here we are assuming it's 6%, but it's up to a certain point, and after this point, if we cut the tax rate further, then the tax revenue will actually start declining, which is our common theory. Now, why is it that if the tax revenue is going down, like from point A to point B, why is the tax, if the tax rate is going down, why is the tax revenue going up? It does not make sense, right? So what the supply side economists are saying, like if the tax rate is going down, then we will have more incentives to work. We will work higher number of hours because now we know, oh, tax rates have gone down, so now I can work more and earn more. So if I am earning more income, that means I have more income taxes to pay on my extra income, right? So that's one of the reasons why when there is a decrease in tax rate, people will work more, they will earn more income, and they will pay more income taxes, and as a result the tax revenues will go up. That's one reason. Now there's another reason why the tax revenues go up, and that's because if we're at a higher tax rate, some people were probably avoiding paying taxes at all, but with the tax rate going down, they will start making some tax payments, right? Before they thought this tax rate is very high, I cannot afford it and I'm not going to make any payments. But now the tax rate has gone down, let's say from 10% to 6%. So, oh, okay, it's affordable now, I can make some payments to taxes, and that's one of the reasons why tax revenues will also go up. But this is only true up to a certain point. So in this case, it's true up to 6%. If tax rates are cut after 6%, then the tax revenue for the government will start declining. This is a very important curve, and we need to understand the concepts. So hopefully what I told you is very clear to you guys. And another thing I can ask is, if you look at this curve, where would the government like to be? What point the government would like to be? So in this case, the government would like to be at point B, right? So this is the point where the government would like to be. Makes sense, right? Because the government at this point is receiving the maximum revenue. That's good for them because they are receiving the maximum revenue, although taxes have gone down, but in this case they are receiving the maximum revenue, so they would like to be at this point. So I can ask you a question in your homework to draw a Laffer curve and label the axis, and then I can ask you also, can you draw the point on the graph where the government would like to be and label it? Then you would basically say point B is where the government would like to be, and the reason is because the revenue is maximized at that point. So this curve was introduced. By the supply side economists, and it's a very useful tool to understand the relationship between tax rate and tax revenues. And tax plays a very important role even in the aggregate supply and aggregate demand. But for supply side, tax also plays an important role. If tax rates go down, what happens is producers get incentive to produce more. So as a result, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, and the production possibility frontier of the economy also goes to the right because there's more output coming out. Similarly, if there is an increase in taxes, then producers will have to pay more taxes, so they will be discouraged to produce more. So aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, output will fall, and PPF will also shift inwards. Okay, so in slide 12 you will see it gives a breakdown of who owns the public debt. The US has a public debt of $11 trillion. Who basically owns these debts? Like who does the government has to pay this $11 trillion? So 33% is foreign ownership, foreign countries, and people outside of US. 33% of the debt is owned by foreign ownership. Then 12% is by government agencies, such as Social Security Trust. 13% is state and local governments, such as city and county governments. 13% is by the Federal Reserve. They are the ones who regulate the supply of money and create money, so they control 13%. 11% is by US financial institutions, which are the banks and credit unions, and US individual, us as bondholders, own 9% of that debt. So it gives you a rough idea of who owns the debt of the government. Now there are some myths associated with public debt, and we have to understand what those debts are, what those myths are. Okay, so one myth about public debt is that federal, if there's too much public debt and if there's too much budget deficit over the years and the government has a huge public debt, then the government will become bankrupt. That is a myth. It is not true. The reason for this is because government plays a very important role in managing the entire financial system, right? They play an important role in selling, buying bonds. They play an important role in issuing bonds. They play an important role in printing money, supplying money. So they control the financial system a great lot, right? So it's very unlikely they will go bankrupt, and because they can refinance their debts anytime they want. So let's say the government takes a loan from Ibrahim, and then let's say that note is going to mature now, and the government needs to pay Ibrahim. He can easily switch to Lait and refinance it, refinance that note and pay off Ibrahim. Okay, so that way government can move from one entity to another and refinance it constantly without becoming bankrupt. However, it can become bankrupt if they are mismanaging the funds. Okay, if they are mismanaging the money, or if they are basically, there's a lot of corruption and the money is being wasted, then it can become bankrupt. But in general, federal government is unlikely to become bankrupt. Now there is another myth, or there is another false information out there about the public debt, and that is it too much public debt shifts burden to the future generation. You will probably hear this sometimes, if government has so much public debt, our future generation will suffer because of it. Now this is also not true. Like even if you see during the World War II, government had a huge public debt, right? Because they were spending a lot on the military industry, and as a result they were having budget deficits and public debt went up. But we are not suffering those consequences. Are we suffering the consequences of that high public debt? We are not. We are still fine. We are okay. So as long as the resources are wisely used, there is economic growth and the debt is managed properly. So as long as the debt is properly and wisely managed and used, and there is economic growth in the society, then it will not be shifted to the future generation. So these are the two things that are myths associated with public debt, that federal government will become bankrupt, which is not true, and then too much public debt shifts burden to the future generation, and that is also not true. However, there are some true burdens of public debt, or there are some problems associated with public debt. And the first one is public debt basically drives out private investments, or in other words, it causes crowding out effect, right? Again, if there is too much public debt, most likely government is borrowing money from the banks. As a result, there is less funds available. Interest rates are going up. Banks are now charging higher interest rates because there's limited funds, and as a result private investors are discouraged to make any investments because there's interest rates are high, so they don't want to make any investments, and as a result these investments are driven out, causing crowding out effect. Okay, so that's one true burden of public debt. Another burden or another disadvantage of public debt that it is some income and wealth redistribution has occurred. The public debt, majority of the public debt is actually held by the upper class people who have more income, right? Probably they are the ones who spend more money, but if we look at the public debt per capita, this debt is equally spread out among the people, even people who earn very little. They also have a portion of that public debt. So there's some level of redistribution needed, and that's a problem with public debt. Finally, the one last thing that the chapter talks about is budget deficits are related to trade deficits, and budget surplus is related to trade surplus. Okay, so by now we know what budget deficit and budget surplus is. Again, budget deficit is when the government is spending more money than the tax revenues, and at the end their budget has a negative balance. And budget surplus is when the government is spending less than the tax revenue they are earning, and at the end the budget has a positive balance. That's budget surplus. Okay, now what about trade deficit and trade surplus? What do they mean? So basically, trade deficit means Trade deficit is occurs when we have imports are greater than exports. Okay, and trade surplus occurs when exports are greater than imports. Okay, so basically what this chapter is saying, or what we economics says, is budget deficit leads to trade deficit. So if we have budget deficit, it will lead to trade deficit, and I will explain how it does. And it also says if we have budget surplus, we will have trade surplus. Okay, so basically what we are trying to say is, if the government is spending more than the tax revenues they are getting in the economy, then in this type of situation we will have imports greater than exports. On the other hand, if the government is spending less money compared to the tax revenues they are earning, we will have a situation where exports will be greater than imports. But how? Okay, so let's look into that. Let's look into the budget deficit scenario, and then you will automatically understand how it's the other case occurs. Okay, so when there is a budget deficit, when government is spending more money than the tax revenues they are spending, what's happening is the savings rate is very low. Okay, the savings rate for not when we are saving money is very low. So what happens is people are selling more and more of their debt to foreign investors, and as a result the value of dollar is going up. Okay, so when I say the value of dollar is going up, means, let's say previously $1 was 20 pesos, but now the value of dollar has gone up because of budget deficit, so $1 is now becomes 30 pesos. Okay, so value of dollar has gone up. Now think of this in terms of imports and exports. With $1 we can probably buy now more goods from Mexico, right? Probably we can buy more goods with $1. But on the other hand, for Mexico, in order to buy a good that's $1, they have to spend 30 pesos now versus 20 pesos. So for them it's more expensive to buy goods from the US or US produced goods and services. So exports will go down and imports will go up, causing trade deficit, right? So that is what it's saying, that budget deficit ultimately leads to trade deficit. Same way budget surplus ultimately leads to trade surplus. So that covers this chapter. So we are pretty much done with this chapter. So I will end here. In my next lecture I will start talking about chapter 10, and that we will start talking about money and money supply. So that's an interesting chapter, because we're going to talk about money, right? So everyone likes money. Anyways, for this lecture that's all. If you have any questions, again, feel free to email me, or send me a message. Well, thank you. I'll be back soon again. Bye.